Over the last century, Jewish communities across the Muslim world have all but vanished. But this country tells a different story. At the crossroads of Europe and Asia, Turkish Jews have held on for thousands of years. Through empires and revolutions, from the Ottoman Sultan who made space for Jewish exiles, to a republic that turned the world they knew upside down. When peace and prosperity became persecution and prejudice, they adapted, keeping their heads down, but their pride intact. And somehow, they endured. So how did the Turkish Jewish community survive against all odds? Modern-day Turkey sits at the heart of what was once a sprawling empire. But long before Ottoman rule, Greek-speaking Jews known as the Romaniote had made a home in this corner of the world. In 1453, the Ottoman Turks blew into Constantinople and established their reign. To rebuild and repopulate the city, the Sultan ordered whole communities, including Jewish ones, to move in. Romaniote Jews from the Balkans found themselves resettled in Constantinople, adding their voices to the crowded streets of a reborn imperial capital. They were soon joined by a smattering of Ashkenazi Jews fleeing the persecution of medieval Europe. But the Jewish population of the Ottoman Empire really exploded in 1492, when Spain expelled every Jew under its dominion. Spanish Jews poured into the Ottoman Empire. Large waves of Portuguese Jews followed suit when they were forced out a few years later. The Iberian refugees brought whatever possessions they could save, a rich heritage of Sephardic customs and rituals and Spanish dialects that eventually fused into a language called Ladino. When they stepped off the boat at Constantinople, they found a different world. Like other regions under Muslim rule, non-Muslims in the Ottoman Empire were considered dhimmi, a protected second class. They didn't have as many privileges as the Muslim population, and they had to pay a steep tax. But in exchange, the Ottomans let their subjects practice their religion as they wished. The conqueror of Constantinople, Sultan Mehmed II, even appointed a chief rabbi to represent the Jewish community. And here was the even bigger twist for the Spanish and Portuguese Jews. They weren't the only other. The empire was also home to large numbers of Greek Orthodox and Armenian Christians. In Christian Europe, being the other meant living in a dark cloud of stigma. Jewish communities suffered a constant simmer of persecution, hostility, and expulsion. They were blamed for everything: lost children, plagues, economic failure. But being an other under the Ottomans wasn't usually a black mark. Minorities were more or less accepted. Religious freedom was expected and usually granted. Jewish scholarship blossomed in this fertile ground of tolerance, producing some of Judaism's most famous prayers and influential books on Jewish law. 150 years of economic stability and cultural vibrancy followed after the first Spanish Jews arrived in Ottoman lands. But then, in 1648, there was a fly in the ointment. Shabbetai Tzvi was an eccentric from Izmir who branded himself the Jewish Messiah. The local rabbi soon tired of his blasphemous behavior and excommunicated him. So Shabbetai Tzvi wandered across Ottoman territory, performing bizarre rituals including marrying a Torah scroll. And then events dialed up to a fever pitch. In 1665, his right-hand man proclaimed that Shabbetai Tzvi would soon rule the Ottoman Empire. Well, the Sultan did not like that at all. So he arrested Shabbetai Tzvi and gave him a choice: convert to Islam or face his final end. Shabbetai Tzvi chose Islam. He lived out the rest of his life as Aziz Mehmed Effendi. The Shabbetai Tzvi affair was mortifying for the Jews, many of whom had come to believe his messianic claims. It was also one of the most potent symbols of Ottoman tolerance, because the Sultan didn't punish the wider Jewish community for Shabbetai Tzvi's antics. He didn't call for their expulsion, or jail the leaders, or levy a massive fine. He just left them alone. This was unheard of in Europe. Even the tiniest rumor of Jewish wrongdoing sparked deadly pogroms and collective punishment. But in the Ottoman Empire, the Jews lived in a unique environment of coexistence. But after 350 years of peace, stability, and prosperity, political earthquakes began to shake the empire. As the 19th century matured, Ottoman subjects fought for new national borders and independence. The Ottomans hoped to quash this rising nationalism, so they ended the dhimmi system, making Jews, Muslims, and Christians equal citizens. But it was too late. The Sultan's grip on the region was weakening, and the young Turk revolutionaries who took over devolved into a repressive authoritarian regime. World War I was the final nail in the coffin for the Ottomans, and the most significant inflection point for Ottoman Jews since the Spanish expulsion. When the war ended, Europe's victorious powers carved up the former empire. And in 1923, after years of bitter fighting between Turkish nationalists and the Kingdom of Greece, a new country was born, the Turkish Republic, led by a charismatic leader who believed in Turkification, building a modern secular country where Turkishness was the defining characteristic of its citizens. Speaking Turkish, and in many respects being Muslim, were essential for a true Turkish identity. In theory, minorities were equal citizens of this new republic. The treaty that ended the fighting between Turkey and Greece designated Jews, Greeks, and Armenians as minorities with special rights. But they weren't Muslims, and in many cases, they didn't speak Turkish. For hundreds of years, the Jewish community in Western Anatolia and Thrace had chatted, transacted, and studied in Ladino, the Judeo-Spanish mashup written in Hebrew letters dating back to the exiled Iberian Jews. But now they were in Turkey, where speaking Turkish was imperative. Some Turks viewed Ladino as proof that the Jews were a subversive fifth column, a threat from within. So the Jewish community tried to prevent themselves from being viewed as a separate nation within a nation, like the Greeks, the Armenians, and even the Muslim Kurds were sometimes perceived. They no longer referred to themselves as Jews or Yehudi. They were Turks first and foremost, Turks of Jewish faith, no different from Turks of Islamic faith. They called themselves by a new name, Musevi, a follower of Moses. But in the eyes of many Turks, they were still an other who could never be true Turkish people. Within just a few years of Turkey's establishment, minorities gave up the special group rights they had received when Turkey formed. History has never definitively proven why, but it was almost certainly under duress. And the government-led discrimination started to snowball, starting with the pressure campaign to speak Turkish and only Turkish. Non-Turkish speaking teachers in Jewish schools were forced to resign. Ladino signage was outlawed. Everywhere the Jews looked were posters and headlines and billboards exhorting them, "Citizen, speak Turkish." Some local authorities even slapped fines on anyone speaking any other language in public spaces. In the face of all this, the Jewish community developed an unwritten policy for survival. Kayades, a Ladino word meaning silence. Don't complain, don't criticize, don't say anything that will draw the wrong kind of attention, because the memory of what happened to other minorities loomed large. The Armenian genocide, the forced expulsion of the Greeks, the ruthless suppression of the Kurds. The Jews knew they could be next, so Kayades was vital. But that snowball of discrimination soon morphed into an avalanche. By June 1934, the Turkish government was determined to force minorities to assimilate. So they passed a law banning non-Turkish speakers from living in certain zones. The government left the decision about whom to expel and when up to the local authorities. And some of those authorities saw an opportunity to rid their provinces of their hated minorities. Just 2 weeks after the law passed, Muslim mobs in eastern Thrace went on a rampage, trashing Jewish homes and businesses. Local police stood by and did nothing. Within days, 3,000 Jews fled the province, crowding into the Jewish neighborhoods of Istanbul. It was the worst aggression the Turkish Jews had ever known. Within 5 years of the Thrace pogrom, Europe was in flames as World War II raged. Turkey was officially neutral, and its Jewish community stayed out of the clutches of the Nazis. They were spared the grim fate of neighboring communities in Greece, Bulgaria, and the rest of Europe. But the Jews of Turkey were subject to their own persecutions. In the spring of 1941, non-Muslim men were packed off to labor camps across Turkey. For over a year, they were part of labor battalions, forced into a back-breaking grind to build roads and tunnels, often sick with typhus and malaria or infested with lice, and all for no pay. And later that year, the Holocaust touched Turkish shores. In late 1941, Romanian Jews desperate to flee the Nazis crowded into a ship bound for Palestine. The Struma arrived in the waters off of Istanbul as winter set in. The passengers hoped to obtain entry permits to mandatory Palestine, but the British, who controlled Palestine, weren't willing at first to grant these documents. Meanwhile, the Turkish authorities kept the ship quarantined for over 2 months. The conditions on board deteriorated rapidly. The Jewish community of Istanbul knew that the Struma ship was struggling. They sent truckloads of food and supplies and begged the authorities to let them host the passengers in their homes. But the authorities refused to let the passengers off the ship. The conditions on board the Struma went from bad to worse, and in February 1942, the Turkish Coast Guard pushed the ship back out to sea. In a tragic twist of fate, the British authorities had granted entry visas to Palestine for the children on board just a day before the ship was towed out to sea. But the children never made it. The ship didn't have a working engine, and the Black Sea was infested with Soviet submarines. Almost as soon as the ship was back at sea, it was hit by a Soviet torpedo. The 768 Jews of the Struma were lost to the watery depths of the Black Sea, all but one passenger. The Jews of Istanbul were sickened by the ship's terrible end, but they were afraid to speak up too loudly to challenge the government's neglect. Kayadis, stay quiet, don't make too much noise. And then the Turks pulled out something from the Dhimmi playbook. The wealth tax was meant to build up military coffers in case Turkey was compelled to enter the World War. Technically, both Muslims and non-Muslims alike were required to pay this tax, but it really functioned as a wealth redistribution scheme from non-Muslims to Muslims. Jews, Armenians, and Greeks were taxed at astronomical rates. Their homes, possessions, and businesses were auctioned off to eager Turks or seized by the government. Anyone who couldn't pay the tax was sent to remote work camps. Some never returned. The government gave up the wealth tax in 1943 when international newspapers got wind of this egregious policy. But many who lost everything never recovered from their sudden plunge into poverty, or from losing their relatives who disappeared into the black hole of the work camps. But as the globe emerged from the darkness of World War II, a pinprick of hope appeared on the horizon for Turkey's Jews. A new political party formed to challenge the single-party rule that had inflicted so much suffering. Jewish people signed up for the new Democrat Party in droves, even winning seats in parliament. The Democrat Party pledged to reimburse people for the heavy wealth tax, and while they never followed through, the promise alone meant the community could finally breathe freely again. Some Jews even felt safe enough to temporarily abandon their protective policy of kayadis and to speak up about the injustices they'd endured. But many in the community, especially the most impoverished, still felt smothered by Turkification, and they hadn't been able to climb out of the hole dug by the wealth tax and the forced labor battalions. So when the State of Israel was born, they seized the opportunity for a better life. In the span of 3 years, half of the Jewish population of Istanbul left for the new Jewish state. Instead of reckoning with the prejudice the Jewish community had faced, Turkish newspapers accused these Jews of abandoning Turkey, criticizing them for not being real Turks. So to reverse this perception, Jewish community leaders tried to tamp down on the high number of people leaving. There was nothing more dangerous in Turkey than being convicted as traitors in the court of public opinion, because a so-called traitorous minority would soon become a targeted minority. These instincts proved correct. In September 1955, tensions between Greece and Turkey were sizzling, and the state used this as an excuse to provoke a pogrom. Over the course of 2 days, Turks ran riot through Istanbul's Greek neighborhoods, burning, battering, and destroying. Hundreds of churches, homes, cemeteries, and businesses were looted. Men and women were beaten and violated. Terrified, the Jewish community scrambled to hang Turkish flags in front of their homes and businesses to keep the mob at bay and disguise their Jewish affiliation. But not all of them emerged unscathed. The Istanbul Program shook the Jewish community. And as they looked upon the wreckage, they couldn't help but wonder, would they be next? All they wanted was to live in peace in the region their families had called home for centuries. But Turkey's next 2 decades were turbulent, bookended by coups and rocked by deep political instability. And Islamism was rising, a backlash to the heavy-handed secular policies of Turkey's government. By the 1970s, the Islamist movement coalesced into a political party led by a notorious anti-Semite, whose noxious rhetoric deeply rattled the Jews. So the community stayed close-knit. At daily social clubs, children played while their parents drank tea and shared the latest gossip, still speaking Ladino behind closed doors. When the summer heat descended on Istanbul, Jewish families boarded ferries to the islands dotting the Sea of Marmara, temporarily making the island hills into the center of Jewish life. Despite the choppy political waters, the Jewish community coasted along, but their sense of safety permanently shattered in 1986. On a Shabbat morning in September, 2 men burst into the Neve Shalom Synagogue in Istanbul and turned it into a slaughterhouse.
Turkish police said 2 terrorists blew themselves up, but there are indications here that other suspects may have been arrested.
Turkey's government insisted that no homegrown anti-Semitic movement could have done this. Instead, they pointed the finger at the radical Palestinian Abu Nidal organization. The secular government desperately wanted to promote the message that Turks were tolerant, Jewish people were welcome, and anti-Semitism had no place in Turkish society. Reeling from their loss, the Jews were too shocked or unwilling to challenge this. To this day, no one knows if the gunmen had help from local Turks. The memory of Neve Shalom never faded. But the Jewish community was about to enter a new era in its relationship with the Turkish government. As 1992 approached, the community hoped to commemorate the 500th anniversary of the Spanish expulsion, ideally with the government as a partner. And the government agreed. But the government's motivations weren't exactly altruistic. The Turks were eager to join the European Union and to improve their relationship with Israel, an important regional trading partner, and to quash growing awareness of the 1915 Armenian genocide. To present the image of a tolerant Turkey, they needed the help of a willing minority. So the Jewish leaders made a controversial trade-off. In exchange for the government's cooperation in recognizing Jewish contributions to Turkey, the Jewish community promoted the idea that discrimination wasn't real, that anti-Semitism didn't exist, that the Armenians hadn't been victims of genocide. Kayades about their historic mistreatment and about the Turks' mistreatment of others. For decades afterward, the community wrestled with the impact of their choices. Were they responsible for rewriting history, or just doing their best to survive in a hostile environment? And they soon faced yet another turning point. In 2003, a new Islamist party came to power. Months later, 2 of Istanbul's synagogues were hit again by terror. One Shabbat morning, Turkish terror operatives affiliated with Al-Qaeda drove up with devices rigged to explode outside the synagogue doors. The blasts took the lives of 6 Jews and 18 Muslim passersby. The community was shaken once again to its core, and for some, it was a sign to leave. The hope for a comfortable future under Erdogan faded even more as Islamism took center stage and Turkey's diplomatic relationship with Israel disintegrated. Many in the Jewish community looked for a plan B. Some acquired Spanish and Portuguese citizenship, a sort of escape hatch in the face of increased anti-Semitism and a troubled economy. Still, there were some bright points. In 2015, the Jewish community held an unprecedented public menorah lighting, which went off without incident. And that same year, for the first time ever, the Turkish government issued a statement acknowledging the psychological scars of the Struma, although they stopped short of taking any responsibility for the tragedy. Today, only about 13,000 Jews remain in Turkey. It's the biggest Jewish community in the Muslim world, but just a fraction of what it once was. And it's steadily declining. The pull of assimilation is strong. The Jewish social clubs that provided critical community gathering places have largely disappeared. Istanbul synagogues are still functioning, though they operate behind fortified walls and many layers of security. But the call of home still resonates.
İstanbul benim evimdir yani başka bir şeyim olamaz. Yani her geldiğimde geriye evime geldim diye hissediyorum.
Benim ailem Türkiye'deki Yahudilerin büyük çoğunluğunun ailesi 500 küsür yıldır burada. Hatta aralarından 2000 küsür yıldır bu topraklarda yaşayan insanlar var. Doğal olarak biz binlerce yıldır bu toprakların bir ferdiyiz.
Some young Turkish Jews have adopted a new approach of hablaremos, Ladino for let's talk, the opposite of Kayades, a willingness to speak about past and present anti-Semitism. Ladino, once considered to be endangered, is enjoying a slow global revival. Ladino prayers are still sung every Shabbat in Turkish synagogues around the world and recited at Passover Seders. And Turkish Jews, in Turkey and in the diaspora, are still cooking their unique Spanish-influenced delicacies like bizcochos, borrecas, tapada, and pastelicos. So what does survival mean today for Turkey's Jewish community? Well, it's complicated. There isn't one answer. The tension of the present is palpable, and the future is uncertain. But the legacy and tradition are deeply rooted, and that's not going anywhere anytime soon.